So this is a series of lectures on Jesus as a figure of history, and we are on session number 5, where we talk about Jesus as shaman. So we're building a picture based on the historical data that we have used with the criteria that historians use to work with kind of complicated sources to build a picture of Jesus. And using those sources in that way, the thing that we know best, the thing that is most well established about Jesus, the thing that's most well established about Jesus is that he was crucified by Rome, which we'll talk about later on in this series. But the next thing that is most well established about Jesus is that his contemporaries, people understood him as a faith healer and as an exorcist, cast out evil spirits and demons from people. So I want to say a little bit about that because that's so weird in our modern context that it's worth kind of parsing out. When we talk about things like healings and exorcisms, the word that we use in modern parlance for it is miracles. That's not really what how the New Testament talks about it. Generally, Jesus's works like that are called either mighty works or signs and wonders. And Jesus lived in a different social world than we do. In the modern West, sort of our post-Enlightenment world, when we talk about miracles, we tend to think of a world that sort of works according to the laws of physics and chemistry, and sort of everything is set up and runs the way that it runs according to these highly predictable kind of laws. And insofar as there is a God, that God is transcendent, is above the world in some way, sort of totally separate. If miracles are performed, it's because God breaks into the natural order of things, sort of disrupts the natural order of things in order to make changes. And then after that particular miracle is done, God withdraws again up into the heavens or wherever God might be. Jesus' world wasn't like that. That's a very modern and a very Western concept, this idea of God as transcendent and outside of and separate from the world and intervening into the world occasionally to do things. In the ancient world, insofar as people thought about God or the gods, they thought of the divine as suffusing all things, that God was permeating all things at all times. And so when things happened in the world that seemed magical and mystical, that wasn't an aberration. It wasn't an interruption in the regular workings of the world. It was just the way the world works. It's just the way that things are. And so we have to understand when we're reading about people of history that it's important to understand them within their own context and not within ours. That said, doing the work of a historian, we're doing the work of a historian in some ways with some modern and kind of rationalist Enlightenment assumptions, right? And we can't help it. It's the world that we live in, the assumptions that we have. And so with those assumptions, it's worth thinking about what it is that a historian can and cannot say about the miraculous. A lot of historians who work on Jesus as a historical figure, particularly if they're sort of don't have any particular religious commitments themselves, they might just disregard all of the miraculous things that Jesus is known for and only talk about what it is he taught. So what I want to say is that a historian in the nature of the case, doing the work of a historian, can't really talk about the miraculous in that sense. And it's because of the way history works. It's not because something like this couldn't happen. It's just the way that the discipline of history works in the modern world. And it works differently from science, let's say. Because if you're doing science and you want to say, let's see, does apple wood float in water, right? You want to discover that. Well, what you would do, right, is you would take a stick or a log of apple wood and you would drop it in a tub of water and you would see if it would float, and it probably will. You wouldn't be satisfied with that one experiment because maybe that's a very special kind of magical piece of apple wood. Who knows? If you really want to be satisfied as a scientist, you would take 1,000 buckets of water and 1,000 sticks, applewood sticks, and drop them each and see if they float. And you would do some of them where you change the stick but keep the same bucket of water, and you would do several experiments with the same stick and different buckets of water and different sizes and shapes of sticks, and you would replicate this experiment thousands and thousands of times, changing just slight variables to see if you can make any sort of difference, right? This is the way science works. Science works by creating experiments that can be replicated in labs, and then repeating those experiments many, many times. History, on the other hand, is not studying something that can be replicated. History, in the nature of the case, it's just what history is, studies things that happened only once. You can't repeat them. They're unrepeatable. They happened once. And what that means is that historians work in terms of probabilities, right? And they work with the sources that they have, the data that they have, whether it's written or artifacts, and they put all of that data together and to tell a story, and they make sure that the story they're telling is contextually credible and that it accounts for the biases of the authors and the people who are looking at it and all of that stuff. And they try to make a story, and they tell you what probably happened based on the data that they have. Well, miracles, at least in our modern Western sense of sort of intervention into the world, are by definition improbable. Right? That is almost the definition of a miracle, is that something outside of what we think of as sort of the normal standard operating systems of the world happens. It's abnormal. It's improbable. And so, as a result, historians just can't think about that. Historians only deal in probabilities, and miracles, at least in our modern Western sense, are by definition improbable. And so they're just not a set of data that historians can really look at. Which is not to say that miracles don't happen. Things that we call miracles might be just a result of our own worldview being askew, sort of thinking of God and divine power and spirituality as transcendent or separate from the world rather than infused within the world, the way that most human beings have thought about it for most of human history. So perhaps our whole worldview is askew. But whatever the case, historians just can't make probability calls about miracles. It doesn't mean that they didn't happen. It just means that historians can't really talk about them. We don't have the tools in our tool bag to assess miracles. What historians can say, and what almost all historians of Jesus do say, is that in his own day, Jesus was understood to be a faith healer and an exorcist. People in his social circle saw him that way. And that's interesting to think about, right? What does it mean that Jesus is something like what we would think of as a doctor? Right? That Jesus is a healer. How How do we understand that? There's a great story in the Gospels. It's in Mark chapter 5 of Jesus is moving somewhere with his disciples. They're going through, and there's large crowds of people. He's just been teaching and doing miracles, and people are following him. So there's huge crowds of people, and there's a woman who has what our gospel writers call an issue of blood for 12 years. It means she's been menstruating continuously for 12 years. And so she is seeking to be healed of this issue. And she thinks to herself, if I could just get up close to Jesus and just touch his clothing, touch the hem of his stole, then I would be healed. And so she pushes her way through the crowd. And if you remember when we were talking about sort of the stratification of society in Jesus' world, this is very taboo of her to do. She's because of her health condition, she is considered unclean. She's really not supposed to touch anyone, and certainly not. She shouldn't be pushing through a crowd like this, because she renders everyone that she touches unclean in her particular social context. And so she risks all of that being ostracized in order to be healed, to get close to Jesus, because she believes she can be healed. And so she pushes through the crowd, elbows her way through, and finally grabs on to just his clothes, maybe only for a second, just slips through her hand. And she does. She finds herself healed immediately from her condition. But Jesus stops. All this time he's been walking among all these big crowds. Everybody's bumping into each other. And he stops and he turns around and he says, somebody touched me. Who touched me? And his disciples look at him and say, Jesus, what are you talking about? Somebody touched you. Crowds of people, everybody's bumping into each other and pushing each other. We're all standing room only in this walk. Everybody's touching you. What do you mean somebody touched you? And he said, no, you don't understand. I felt the power go out from me. Someone touched me. And so Jesus is a healer. He's a person that people go to for healing, like a doctor almost. And yet, it's not in the way that we would think of a doctor, at least in our modern Western society. There's a power within him that moves through him to people. What is that about? That's an interesting thing. And so, in the ancient world, they didn't have the same sort of divisions that we have. So we think of all the aspects of our lives are very separate, right? You go to church on Sunday or to synagogue or mosque Saturday or Friday or whatever. You do your religious thing there, and then of course you'll go to work and most of the other days of the week. And when you get sick, you'll go to a doctor. And we keep all of these things very separate from one another. In the ancient world, people who you would see for healings are very often the same people who are doing much of the religious work. Doctors and priests are often sort of conflated titles in the ancient world. What the word anthropologist used to talk about this role, both a religious practitioner and a healer, is the word shaman. Shaman. And I said that they were like doctors and priests, but that's not exactly right. Shamans are not priests. Priests are social functionaries, right? Priests are ordained into an established set of rituals for an established deity, right? There's a god or a goddess or a group of gods or goddesses who require a certain kind of ritual to be performed, and this is an ongoing thing. And so you continue to ordain new priests into this society who will be the keepers of the proper ritual. Shamans are different from that. Shamans are healers and they're religious functionaries, but not in the way that priests are. Shamans work in a more direct way with spirits or deities that they know through personal experience, right? And so these are not established rituals, and they're not established social and religious communities. Shamans are working directly in a direct and immediate and personal way with deities and spirits in rituals that they are co-creating with the deities in the moment. So the experience, the direct experience that a shaman has with the deity or spirit that they're working with is often referred to as mystical experience. And mystical experience is, it's not unique to shamans. Lots and lots of people report having mystical experiences. Certainly some of you who are watching this video have had mystical experiences. And you may even know what I'm talking about already just from the title, but to give you a bit more of a description, the philosopher and father of modern psychology, William James, did a lot of work on interviewing folks who had these experiences, and he describes mystical experiences in 4 ways. He says they're transient, right? They come and go. They're transient because they are outside of the realm of normal experience, right? So people who report mystical experiences often have a different sense, a different feeling about the world. Maybe you have an experience where you're washed over with a sense that everything is okay in the world, that it's all going to work out all right. All your worries wash away. Or maybe you have a mystical experience where you have a deep sense, this is a very common feeling that people have in mystical experience, that everything is connected to everything else. It's called a unitive experience, right? A sense of the oneness of all things, a deep sense of the oneness of all things. They also tend to, or mystical experiences often are characterized by altered perceptual states. So auditory hallucinations or visual hallucinations. Hallucination sort of has a bad connotation, but I only mean in the sense of people having a mystical experience will often see something or hear something that can't be heard by others. So it's not vibrations of sound waves vibrating within the room that anybody could hear. It's not images that anybody could pick up on a video camera if they were there. They are images and auditory experiences that are happening within the experiencer. So they're transient in that way. They're also, William James says, mystical experiences are passive, meaning the way that I like to describe that is that they are a gift, right? And so sometimes people have mystical experiences that they have made some preparation for, either by long hours of meditation or fasting. Sometimes mystical experiences can be sort of conjured up by intense physical activity. So you see, shamans doing various kinds of dances, or in the Sufi Islamic tradition, you have the whirling dervish where people spin around and around and around. These are ways of preparing oneself. There are some chemical substances that people use to try to induce mystical experience, and all of these things can help sort of prepare and open the mind in certain ways to mystical experiences. But what James says is that even though you can do a lot of things to prepare, there's nothing that you can do to guarantee that a mystical experience will come. They're a passive gift. There's something that's just offered to us in the moment. And sometimes people have mystical experiences with no preparation at all. Sometimes people are overtaken by a mystical experience. So James describes them as transient, as passive, also as ineffable. There's something about the experience that can't be really communicated in words. You can sort of try to describe what you saw or heard or felt, but there's something about the experience that transcends our ability to be able to communicate it. And finally, he says that they have what he calls a noetic quality. And what he means by that is that people who have mystical experiences report knowing something in the language that's used is often that there's a deep knowing, right? Knowing something about the nature of the world or about God or about one's own identity that sort of transcends anything that you could learn through reading or through experience. It's just a deep inner knowing of things of the world. So I think that Jesus is a Jewish mystic, that Jesus had experiences like this of God. We've already talked about one of them a few times throughout these lectures, and it happened at the baptism of Jesus. So Jesus goes out into the wilderness to be baptized by John, and as he comes up from the water, John dunks him down into the Jordan River. Baptism is a ritual. It's a ritual cleansing, and so as John dunks him down into the Jordan River, he comes up, and Jesus has, in our earliest gospel, as I've mentioned before, in the Gospel of Mark, this vision that's an inner vision, right? Nobody in Mark's gospel, nobody else sees it. In our later gospels that are developments on that story, it of course becomes a public event. But in our earliest gospel, it's something that happens to Jesus. It happens in the experience of Jesus. He sees a dove descending upon him, and then he has an auditory hallucination. He hears a voice from heaven, and the voice says, "You are my son, and with you I am well pleased." And so Jesus has this transient and ineffable experience of the divine, and it changes the way he knows himself. It changes the way he understands God. Jesus' most common language to talk about God is the language of Father, or occasionally Abba, which is an even more familiar. It's like Dad, and so that's a noetic change. It's a deep knowing about Jesus' own self-identity and about who God is that is revealed to him in this mystical experience. Now, Jesus is not the only Jewish person, not the first Jewish person, not the only one to use that kind of language for God, but he's certainly the one who does it most consistently. And I think this is rooted in this kind of mystical experience that Jesus has. And so we see already in that, both in that mystical experience and the fact that Jesus is known as a healer and an exorcist, an image of what anthropologists and religious studies practitioners call the shaman, who's both has this deep and intimate and personal relationship to the divine, and sees God not as some transcendent thing up there, but as an experiential reality, and that the power of that relationship leads to healing, being able to be a healer in his community. Once shamans have had this experience of the divine in some way, they will often talk about being possessed by a particular spirit. Again, we think of possession particularly in the Christian tradition, because of Jesus' interaction with people who are possessed by evil spirits as he exorcises them, as he casts out evil spirits from people. We tend to think of possession in that negative way, and as sort of you would be possessed by a devil or something like this. But in anthropology and in religious studies, when we talk about spirit possession, it just means of any kind of deity or spirit sort of taking over someone's life and guiding them in a particular way. And shamans will often talk about this, having spirits that possess them as they do their healing work within the community. In order to be in contact with these spirits that possess them and guide them in their healing work, shamans often will go on what is called a vision quest. Right, and so this usually happens at the very beginning of a shaman's career. In some cultures, every young person will go on a vision. In some cultures where shamanism is still practiced, every young person will go on a vision quest early in their life, connected usually to puberty. And in some cultures, it will only be people who are training to be shamans who will go on vision quests. But it's a way to connect with one's guardian spirit. And so vision quests in shamanic cultures usually entail somebody going off into a wilderness place, into the woods, into the desert, something like that, and being alone in the wilderness for long periods of time, sometimes 3 or 4 days, or up to a number of months maybe. And while they are there, they will often do the things that one can do to prepare for a kind of mystical experience. So they'll perhaps have extreme fasting during these times. It's a very common way. Maybe also some use of plants and things that have psychedelic properties, or certain kinds of physical exertion that can lead to kind of extreme exhaustion that can open the mind up to these mystical experiences. And in those vision quests, people will connect to a spirit that will guide them. So we see Jesus at the beginning of his career going on what looks a lot to somebody who works in anthropology or religious studies like a vision quest. Jesus goes out immediately after this baptism experience. Jesus goes out into the wilderness for 40 days, and he abstains from food. He fasts. He abstains from any food for 40 days. And he's alone in the wilderness. And we're told there that he's driven by the Spirit into the wilderness, I think is the word that Luke uses for it, driven into the wilderness by the Spirit, as though he's being possessed by the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God lives within him and moves him, drives him to different places. In Jesus' vision quest, he is, we're told he's met by many animals in Mark's gospel, which is a very common experience among vision quests. In Native American cultures, people will often find what we tend to call their spirit animal or their power animal. And so Jesus is met by many animals here. That's a very common shamanic practice. But he's also has an interaction with what the texts call Satan, or a dark spirit. And there in the wilderness, Satan, this evil spirit, gives Jesus 3 temptations. Temptations to a different vocation than the one he's called to. The temptation to be relevant to his culture by being able to make bread and sort of feed the masses, and a temptation to prove himself as some kind of divine hero by jumping off the temple and being rescued by angels, or a temptation to be a ruler of vast territories, to become a military leader, as some people saw him or hoped he would be, and the Messiah that some people hoped he would be. And so he has all these temptations in the wilderness, and he overcomes. He, in a sense, goes to battle with this dark spirit and overcomes him. And there's a noetic quality that seems to come from that. Jesus refers back to this spirit quest, this vision quest, when he's exorcising demons later in his career. Jesus is casting out evil spirits from other people, and his disciples can't do this. They try. They don't have quite the power that Jesus has, and they say, "How do you cast out these powerful demons?" And Jesus says, "Well, it's like this. If you're going to go into a strong man's house and rob the strong man, you would first have to tie him up. You can't go and rob the place while he's roaming around. You have to tie the strong man up. You have to bind him, and then you could rob the house." And it seems to be Jesus' point that, well, I've already defeated the great dark spirit. I've already defeated Satan during my vision quest in the wilderness. I've already tied the strong man up. So I have no problem, plundering his house. It's because I've already done this. I've already gone to battle with this dark spirit. He another time reports another mystical vision where he says, or he reports this mystical vision in Luke's gospel, and he says, "I saw Satan falling like a star from heaven." And so, this is sort of poetic language for whatever it was that Jesus, this internal experience that Jesus had in this wilderness vision quest. It's actually a fascinating parallel story to the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, who, after a long period of fasting, stops to meditate the Buddha has been fasting for so long that he's standing in a river and he nearly passes out. The only way he's able to stand is to hold on to a branch that keeps him from drowning in the river. And a young girl comes and brings him a bowl of porridge. And after having nourished himself, he sits under the Bodhi tree, and he goes to battle with, in his culture, it's the god Mara, who's the god of desire. And Mara brings to Siddhartha 3 temptations, just like Jesus in the wilderness. And Siddhartha overcomes Mara, overcomes this evil spirit of desire, and thereby achieves enlightenment, achieves Buddhahood, becomes the Buddha. These are parallel stories of people who, in their experience of the divine, something happens to them. They're transformed, and because of their transformation, are able to create healing and renewal within their society and in their culture. And so this is one category for thinking about Jesus. This is, I will say, my own. Not a whole lot of historians talk about Jesus in these terms as shaman, although all historians will talk about, or almost all historians will talk about Jesus as a healer and an exorcist, and many will also talk about Jesus as having a mystical or sort of intimate and experiential relationship with God. I think when you combine these two together, that there's a clear sort of way of understanding Jesus in anthropology and in religious studies as a shaman. I think this makes a lot of sense of who Jesus was. And so that's the first lens, the first way that I want to talk about who Jesus is. In the next couple of lectures, we will look at Jesus through other lenses, that of a sage or a teacher, a wisdom teacher, and a prophet. So that's what we'll do next time.